so silly that I'm introducing. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Yeah. This is ADLC's and Global Otters collaborative event, International Solidarity and Indigenous Resistance. Thank you all for coming. Amazing. First, we're going to do a land acknowledgement. Please join me in acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Rumsen and the Ohlone people. Let us also acknowledge the intertwined legacies, the devastation of transatlantic slavery and settler colonialism, which contribute to the creation and continued wealth of this university and to this nation. We acknowledge the reparations owed to Black and Indigenous communities and nations and the impossibilities of return for generations past. Let us also acknowledge the ancestors in the room today as we fight together for better futures. We are alive in an era of awakening and mobilization to preserve this planet and all the beautiful creation that is no doubt worthy of this struggle. And this land acknowledgement was given to Dr. Christine Rosales by Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who got it from unknown Indigenous women in Canada. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Edwin.
Woohoo! Thank you very much. All right then. So our pre-activity, which we might cut a little short, or it can go as long as you want. So as far as I first want to start off by kind of like asking this a question of like, what do you know that's already like going on, right? Hold on. Yeah. So like, what important events are you aware that are going on in South and Central America, and like how are they important to you? Just say it out loud, raise your hand. I don't know.
Climate change.
Of course, climate change. Anywhere specific?
Oh, specifically, like our governments are not prepared to handle this crisis, and they're doing things to make it worse. So that's an issue. Also, an intersection with Indigenous land rights, of course, like building pipelines, and the continued reality of colonialism becomes apparent to us only when that shit hits the news, but it's always happening. So
I would say also for me, deforestation and like keeping Indigenous people off of their land.
Yeah, go for it.
Oil spills and the various, I don't remember where it was, but it was more recently. Well, it was Palestine, Ohio. That spill that like contaminated the groundwater and all the water, and for everyone there, and different things like that have been happening, especially the Indigenous people.
That was a spill of vinyl chloride, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I just want to mention the oil sands up in Alberta is ruining the indigenous land for the Native Americans that live, those tribes up there in the province of Alberta in Canada. Yeah. And that's due to sand. It's not shale oil, but they get extract oil from the sands, the tar sands. They call it the tar sands, and that's really hurting the wildlife up there, so that the tribes can't hunt like they used to.
Yeah, so you guys are kind of picking up on one of the core things I want to bring up, which is, the Americas as a whole is from Canada all the way down to the southernest tip of Argentina and Chile. And like a lot of big problem with a lot of Americans is that they only see the United States, which is fair because given our media, that's how it's often framed. That being said, I would like to move into some acknowledgments of not only of what we're keeping in mind, but what I'm going to be talking about, as it will be in generalizations. It's a massive continent with a lot of ongoing. It's impossible to get into the nuances of every little gritty detail. That being said, I'll be talking about the political, economic, and cultural trends and kind of establish how it's less so about the specific nation state and social movements that have transitioned outside of the traditional way of viewing things within our dialectics. So the first part I would like to get into is, the historical context, as you do with any issue. I think the best way of understanding the current state of Americas is to understand the history as well as the relationship the United States has had with the rest of the continent. From its beginning, it has been one of domination, from erasing the natives and the enslavement of Africans. But the global relationship was set in stone during the Mexican-American War. This event was unprompted, and it was clearly to take land. It also established how the U.S. saw the rest of the land south of its border. And this was solidified by the Monroe Doctrine. And it affirmed that the Americas was the U.S.'s to control and influence for the coming decades. Oh, whoops. Up to the Cold War, where we see, and up till today, where we see indirect and direct intervention by the United States, either supporting coups, strategies of destabilization, to ensure that these countries are still reliant on the U.S. for trade, and to ensure that the extraction of resources can continue as it did during the colonial era. So what exactly is going on? If I had to summarize it, I would say indigenous sovereignty, as they're the core they've created the core fundamentals for these large social movements, resulting in electoral wins for leftist governments throughout the continent. Like, a good 90% of it now has at least a left-leaning leader, on top of the ones that already had existed and had survived the initial eradication. And this has also brought into question of how we view democracy and liberalism in general, as these social movements have been to change the material conditions of South Americans, but oftentimes we see it as a continuation of corruption, authoritarianism, and we often criticize any changes as, not democratic. And another thing we often ignore is, like, they just say protests. They don't say the history of these protests, who it is. And oftentimes it is indigenous people. So in that way, it's continuing the legacy of erasure. But it's also ignoring that these coalitions are not just of indigenous people or any single group, but of labor unions, of feminists, and other marginalized communities that have come to realize that these oppressed systems affect them all. To which I bring the case study of Peru. I mean, I'm sure all of you have watched our Abolition Now episode on that, where we went to the very nitty-gritties of what is going on in Peru. But if for some reason you did it, the quick summary or the narrative is that President Castillo was arrested after trying to dissolve Congress in a coup, and then that resulted into political unrest. But this way of viewing this situation is, like I said, ahistorical and ignores the nuances. The reality is that President Castillo is an indigenous person. He is Andean and reflects much of the population that has been marginalized under the Peruvian government. He also represents a challenge and resistance to it. And what people don't realize is that who he's up against is the Fujimori family, who, if you don't know, Alberto Fujimori was a dictator of Peru for a few decades. And under his reign, not only did people suffer of austerity policies, they also suffered actual eugenics and genocide at the government. And for the past 5 election cycles, it has been his daughter, Keiko Fujimori, that's been up against opposition. And the Peruvian people have put moderates, centralists, other conservatives in power, only for them to fizzle out. So Castillo really represented a challenge to that, being an unknown name in politics. He was just a union organizer for teachers. And even though he really didn't do anything under his administration, he represented that change. And so when he was arrested, people didn't see it as just arresting an incompetent leader, but a regression back to Fujimori rule. And another thing to notice is that the Congress that did impeach him is one of the most unpopular in the world, with about less than 20%. So in these ways, it kind of challenges, like, was it really undemocratic for him to try to dissolve Congress? Was it really undemocratic for him to try to fulfill the promises he was elected for in a system that was designed to not let anything change in the first place? these are the questions I was kind of asking and leading into. Like the words democracy and freedom are thrown around all the time, and especially in South and Central America, that's how the U.S. positions itself. It's how Western media positions itself. But like, who established these democracies in the first place? Like, who had the biggest say in the table when independence was finally held? Who is determining what is and isn't democratic? And that these countries do have their independence, but only now are they experiencing sovereignty through decolonization and listening to those most marginalized in their community. But why is this happening now? And why is it happening in this way? So I've already mentioned that corruption, the discontent, the political instability is something we see in Latin America. But it's not just, it's not just happening because, it's Latin America. It's always that way. Nothing changes. It's because of systemic pressures and because of, foreign interference. Not to mention that it's also the key point of neoliberalism. Its policies, they're unpopular. They cause these instabilities in the way that it ensures that education is not had, that infrastructure is not improved. In various ways, it creates discontent. And in order to maintain these unpopular policies, every time there's a sign of change, the U.S. usually goes in and directly interferes, either with coups or funding far right-wing terrorism, the Contra groups, spreading disinformation and manipulating the American public, right? Like, it's not democratic that he's seeking another election, even though he has a high approval rate. The way they frame these things is to discredit the agency of these people. And anyone that opposes, or those who are still left opposing, are embargoed. They're isolated. Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, resulting in a more militaristic relationship. They do not want, or militarism was not what they sought out for, but it's what they had to do under these pressures. And it also fuels the war on drugs, which has been largely, unsuccessful in its goal. But what it has done is created police states. I think El Salvador, which now has a mega prison, and sure, crime rate is down, but so is fear. It's creating a migration problem as people avoid prosecution. And it's not just going after criminals, it's just going into poor areas. It's targeting poor and marginalized communities, as is the goal for a lot of these policies. And the idea that neoliberalism and capitalism has, spread freedom and choice is just demonstrably false in this continent. And so I bring into question institutions of democracy. You have the United Nations, the Organization of American States, which is specific to the continent, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. These things are framed to encourage prosperity, to encourage democracy. But in reality, it creates, disenfranchisement. It takes away independence from these countries in a way we can't really understand unless we really look in deep. I bring up the example of Bolivia, which during the 2019 coup, which was after the re-election of Evo Morales, was framed that he was power grabbing another term instead of democratically being elected. And in this, they were then pushing far-right conspiracies of election fraud, which is now pretty standard in every election these days. And it kind of shows a way how it was prototyped in Bolivia specifically, that we then saw in our 2020 election. But it failed at the end of the day. In 2019, they undid, within a year, the Bolivian people were able to undo the coup with mass protests and rioting. And in this time, other organizations are supposed to, maintain democracy, kind of turned a blind eye. The United Nations did not give the time of day to Bolivian people. The OAS did not report on police brutality and killing of protesters. And they did the same, or are doing the same in Peru. And it's not until the coup clearly has gone sideways and that people are really suffering that they finally denounce. But they don't cease economic pressures. They don't start sanctions. They don't pull resources. Instead, they just offer their thoughts and prayers. They condemn it, but they don't do anything to stop it. But it leads me to say, like, what's different? So if you look into Latin American politics, it kind of does seem like the cycle of country democratically elects a slightly left-leaning leader, things go well, they improve, there is a political crisis, and all of a sudden you're back to step one. And it does seem like the cycle, and it has been that way since the Cold War. But what I think is different is what's the coalitions that are fueling these movements today, which is one of a lot of intersectionality between these social movements, as I mentioned. It's not just indigenous people, it's feminists, it's not feminists, it's the anti-racists, and so forth. And what this really resulted in is not only a coup falling face flat in Bolivia, but also resulted in other countries aiding Bolivia during its time of crisis. Evo Morales fled to Mexico for refuge during this time, and at the time they did house him. But as he was escaping, there were a few attempts on his life. The most famous example is someone shot an RPG at his plane. And so in these ways, you can see that they were trying to directly stop him. But what they didn't realize is that the social movement in Bolivia wasn't about Evo Morales. It was about the people who supported him, his political party, which is MAS, which is consistent of indigenous and labor unions. And the United States, or I guess not the United States, but foreign policy could not understand that. They didn't understand how their movement or how their plan had just fallen apart so quickly. And and in this you can kind of see the key points, that it's all about solidarity between leftists, and especially the indigenous movements, which I'll kind of get into later, but is what I see as the main problem with how we view these issues in North America. So, and it's not just in dialogue, it's not just in activism, it's not just in political asylum. These movements have resulted in governments that reflected the beliefs and ideologies. We've seen this in a large economic cooperation, a lithium alliance between Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, which coincidentally is when the Peruvian coup happened. It was within the week that these countries were supposed to meet to discuss, how to price lithium, how to use it, how to trade it, in a time where, the West and other imperial powers are trying to figure out the best way they can get lithium for cheap. We also see the rise of CELAC again, which was just a forum to talk for South American countries. That's really become a way to organize, especially with Brazil, after ousting their far-right president of Bolsonaro, has re-entered the fold. And Lula, who was also imprisoned for fake corruption charges in the last Brazilian election, has come back roaring onto the scene. He's even considered a plan to bring back a united currency for Latin America. He's really been discussing this with Argentina and bringing up with CELAC members. Things that are so challenging to U.S. homogeneity that you wouldn't think that it would last more than a week. But these are happening because these social movements have been successful in retaking back their democratic institutions. He's also proposed the expansion of BRICS, which, if you don't know, is an economic cooperation between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa with other CELAC members. So they're trying to expand these economic policies to break away from their dependence on the United States. And it's not just for economic benefits, but it's also true to their beliefs. With Cuba especially, if you trade with Cuba, you are banned from U.S. ports for 6 months. And that goes for a lot of things. Like, if we're looking at just an economic sense, you wouldn't trade with a country that gets you banned from one of the biggest markets in the world for 6 months. That just doesn't make sense. But CELAC members are doing it anyways, because they realize it's not about economics, it's about building a relationship, a sustainable one, and one that they're mutually beneficial, that's not just an economic lens. Cuba gives them medical information and knowledge, they give them the resources they need to continue thriving as an island. They've also made steps to walk away from the war on drugs. We see this in legalization movements. Bolivia and Colombia just did a presentation at the United Nations to legalize the coca leaf for indigenous usage, and not to, just burn down the farms of poor farmers because they're growing a substance that may be turned into a substance farther up the supply chain. Mexico has also made great leaps in legalizing weed at a federal level, something that we haven't even done. Like, we've barely done it at a state by state level, and even then it's always like a thin level of progress that can always be pushed back at any second if we ever lose a majority support. And these ways you can see how it's not just like breaking away because it's economic. They're breaking away because it's the only way to become dependent on themselves, to be sovereign, and it takes form in decolonization. So I'll quickly wrap up and open for discussion. But I just want to, the whole point is to ensure that the Americas is not just the United States. It's not monolithic. And to understand the world, you need to understand the history and the power dynamics behind it. And understanding things from a global perspective allows you to understand our domestic issues. So I say to that, stay informed. Telesur, Democracy Now!, the one I can never pronounce, but it's from Bolivia, and I really trust as a source. And of course, tune into Abolition Now with me and Dana, and not Megan, which we regularly talk about this kind of stuff from a global perspective and theoretical one. I'll take it from here.
Thank you, Edwin. Can you go back to that last slide for a second? Yeah, I just wanted to plug our radio show there at the bottom. So a lot of the content for this event that you just heard was compiled ahead of time in the process of reporting on these issues as they happened, right? When this was happening with Castillo in Peru, we did an episode on it, right? We've done episodes on U.S. interventionism where we go deep into the CIA, all of the conspiracy theories that are actually true. We have a whole episode on that. We have an episode all on Puerto Rico, on the issues of U.S. colonialism, like literal U.S. colonialism that still exists. Like, we have literal colonies like Puerto Rico, and so we did an episode on sovereignty on that. So it's on Otter Media, Wednesdays 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., but we also have a YouTube channel where you can watch recorded versions of all those shows. I really want to go back to this point here that Edwin made here, that understanding this from a global perspective helps us understand our domestic politics. And I think that this really comes through in the point about Bolivia suffering a right-wing coup after an election fraud myth a year before 2020, right? We reacted to the fascist attempted coup on our government saying, this is something that would happen in a banana republic. And that just goes to show how limiting national identity can be, right? Because if we see ourselves as fundamentally different from the world, right, as we're superior or American exceptionalism, right, then boy, are we screwed, right? Because the rest of the world is not only we can learn from the way that indigenous movements and workers' movements in other countries are organizing, right? But we can be aware of the way that fascism operates in other countries because that's what's happening here now too, right? Yeah, those are my thoughts. Do you want to move to the next slide? Next one? Yeah, I'd also just like to say thank you, Edwin, for putting this presentation together, and thank you to Global Otters for letting us talk about politics for so long. And yeah, I'll bring it back to you or open it up to discussion.
Well, first, thank you. You actually put the slides together, and God, my ass, how'd you do this?
Group effort, group effort, like everything we do. Yeah, Helene. Thank you.
Yeah, also quickly, as the president of Global Otters, I really want to say thank you to Edwin and Dana, also about the ADLC for wanting to come and speak about this. I feel like this really aligns with what we want our club to promote, and it's great that we're able to have this cross-club collaboration. So if you have any other interesting topics at a later point,
feel free to reach out. We would love to be able to do this again. So thank you.
Yeah.